contract had been signed with her sister's name. Ivy only discovered this the morning she was loaded into a carriage like a trunk of winter linens. Quietly, efficiently, without anyone asking if she was ready. She had not been ready. She was not ready now. The wool of her travel dress itched against her collarbone where the clasp of her gray cloak sat slightly crooked, and she had not been allowed time to fix it. Her single braid, rushed and uneven, hung over one shoulder. Her hands were folded in her lap, with the careful stillness of someone who had learned very early that stillness was the only armor available to her. Outside the carriage window, the grounds of Ashford Manor dissolved into road and then into forest. She watched the last iron gate swing shut behind her and felt something close in her chest. Not grief exactly. Something older. Something that had been closing for years and had only now finished. She had lived at Ashford Manor for 23 years. She had been invisible there for most of them. Her father, Lord Edmund Ashford, had 2 daughters. Celeste, the elder by 4 years, was everything the name Ashford required. Tall, socially precise, trained in diplomacy and table manners and the particular art of making powerful men feel correctly admired. Celeste wore silk with authority. Celeste laughed at exactly the right moments. Celeste had been the one chosen, betrothed, prepared, the one whose name had been inked onto a marriage contract with the sovereign of the Northern Pax, the Alpha King himself. Ivy was the other one. She pressed her fingertips together in her lap and tried to think clearly, which was difficult when the carriage kept lurching over frozen ruts in the road, and her stomach had not settled since dawn. 3 days ago, Celeste had disappeared. Not dramatically. No screaming, no broken furniture, no tearful farewell. Celeste had simply been gone when the chambermaid arrived with her morning tray. Bed made, wardrobe emptied of the traveling clothes, a faint trace of rosewater still hanging in the cold air like an insult. A letter had been found on her vanity, sealed and addressed to their father in Celeste's clean, sloping hand. Ivy had not been allowed to read it. She had pieced it together from the sounds that came through the walls, her father's voice rising, then going dangerously flat. The steward summoned. The doors closed and locked. Hushed conversations in the corridor that stopped the moment she approached. And then, sometime before midnight, the soft knock on her own door. Her father entering with that expression, she knew better than she knew almost anything. The one he wore when he had already made a decision, and was only now informing her of it. "The contract stands," he had said. "You will go in her place." She had stared at him. "Father, the Alpha King is expecting Celeste. He has never seen me. He doesn't know I exist." "That," her father had said, adjusting his cuffs, "is precisely why this will work." He had not asked if she was willing. He had not asked if she was frightened. He had told her the carriage would depart at first light, and that she should pack only what was necessary, because the Northern Keep would provide everything a lady required. She had spent the night sitting on the edge of her bed, staring at the floor, trying to locate some feeling she could use. Anger, courage, anything with edges. What she found instead was a hollowness so complete it almost felt like calm. She was not Celeste. She had no political training, no practiced grace, no particular talent for managing powerful men. She was the quiet daughter, the one who had spent her years in the manor's library more than its receiving rooms, who knew the names of medicinal herbs and could read old pack script, but had never once been prepared for a political marriage. And now she was being sent, in her sister's name, carrying her sister's contract, to the most dangerous alpha on the continent. The carriage hit a deep rut. Ivy grabbed the window frame and held on. Outside, the forest had thickened. The trees here were pines, ancient and dense, their branches heavy with the gray weight of coming snow. The air that seeped through the window gap smelled of resin and cold earth, and something sharper underneath. The particular wild scent of territory that had been held for generations by a single pack. She had read about it. the northern reaches. 300,000 acres of forest, mountain, and fortress stone, governed by a king who had never been challenged twice by the same enemy. Cassian Drave. She had heard his name spoken in careful voices since she was a child. Not with fear exactly, with the particular awareness reserved for things that did not need to threaten you directly to make you understand you had no power over them. The way her father's counsel spoke of winter floods, or of the moon on a full shift night, simply as a fact that required respect. She had never imagined she would be sent to him. She had never imagined she factored into anything her father planned. Ivy sat back against the seat and made herself breathe evenly. Think, she told herself. You are good at thinking. Think. The facts were these. The contract bore her sister's name, not hers. The Alpha King had agreed to a bride from House Ashford, but he had been shown Celeste's portrait, Celeste's credentials, Celeste's lineage summary. He was expecting a woman who knew how to navigate a king's court. He was expecting composure and strategy, and the kind of beauty that was designed to be displayed. He was going to receive Ivy instead. Her gray cloak, her crooked clasp, her uneven braid. A cold understanding settled over her, quiet and precise as the first ice forming over still water. Her father had not done this for her sake. He had done it because the contract penalty for a broken betrothal was ruinous. The Ashford lands, the remaining fortune, the title itself. He had done it because Celeste had refused and run, and there was no one left to send but the daughter he had never needed for anything until now. He had done it because Ivy was available, because she was quiet, because she would not fight him at midnight when the decision had already been made, because he had always known she would comply. She stared at the pine trees moving past the window. For a long moment, she felt nothing at all. Then, slowly, something began to harden in the center of her chest. It was not yet anger. It was something quieter and more durable, the particular feeling of someone who has just understood the exact shape of what was done to them and has decided to remember it. The carriage rolled on. By midday, snow had begun to fall. By late afternoon, the trees had parted enough to reveal the first sight of the northern keep, a mass of dark stone rising against a sky the color of old pewter, its towers visible long before the road delivered her to its gates. No banners flew from the ramparts in celebration of a bride's arrival. The guards at the outer gate wore black leather and moved with the unhurried precision of men who had never needed to perform authority because they simply carried it. No one had come to welcome her. The carriage stopped. The door opened from the outside. A steward in dark wool stood waiting, his expression carefully professional. But she caught the flicker in his eyes when he saw her. The small hesitation. He had been told to expect someone else. Lady Celeste Ashford, he said, his tone measured and perfectly courteous. The king awaits. Ivy stepped down from the carriage onto frozen stone. The cold hit her like a wall, clean and brutal, smelling of pine resin, granite, and wood smoke from somewhere deep inside the fortress. Snow caught in her lashes. She looked at the steward. Yes, she said quietly. I am here. It was not a lie, exactly. She was here. She was a lady of Ashford. She had arrived. What she had not said was her name. She had not corrected him. And as she followed him through the iron gates of the northern keep, her gray cloak dusted with snow and her braid slightly undone by the wind, Ivy Ashford walked into the worst mistake her family had ever made, and the only honest thing that had ever happened to her. She just didn't know yet which of those things would save her. The steward's name was Aldrich, and he walked too fast for someone escorting a guest. Ivy kept pace with him through corridors that smelled of beeswax and cold stone, her boots clicking against floors of dark slate that reflected the torchlight in long, wavering strips. The keep was nothing like Ashford Manor. The manor had been built to impress visitors, its ceilings painted, its walls hung with tapestries depicting the family's more flattering history, its hearths surrounded by carved marble. The northern keep had been built to endure. The walls were thick and unapologetic. The archways were high and plain. The sconces held thick tallow candles, rather than decorative silver fixtures, and the light they cast was warm but honest. It illuminated everything it touched without flattering any of it. She noticed that there were no flowers, no arrangements prepared in honor of a bride's arrival, no garlands along the staircase, no perfumed rushes on the floors. Either the northern keep did not mark such occasions with decoration, or no one here had been particularly invested in celebrating this one. Both possibilities felt equally believable. Aldrich led her up a broad staircase, then down a narrower corridor, then through a heavy door into a receiving room that was warmer than anything she had passed through. A large hearth burning at the far end, 2 high-backed chairs positioned near it, a side table holding a tray with a clay pitcher and 2 cups. The window opposite the hearth looked out over the inner courtyard, where snow was now falling steadily, turning the gray stone white along every ledge and sill. "The king will attend you shortly," Aldrich said, turning to face her. His voice was perfectly composed. His eyes were not. They moved over her, over the gray cloak, the simple linen dress beneath it, the slightly undone braid, the absence of jewelry, with the focused attention of someone performing a rapid and uncomfortable calculation. She met his gaze and said nothing. He cleared his throat. "May I ask, the portrait we received, Lady Celeste?" It was understood. "My father sends his warmest regards to the king," Ivy said. Her voice came out calm. She was faintly surprised by this. The journey was long. I would appreciate a moment to compose myself before the meeting, if that is possible. It was a non-answer wrapped in politeness, and they both knew it. But Aldrich was too well trained to press further without instruction from his king. He gave a short bow, told her the pitcher held warm water, and that she should ring the bell on the mantel if she needed anything, and withdrew. The door closed. Ivy stood still for a moment, listening to his footsteps recede down the corridor. Then she moved to the hearth and held her hands over the fire, watching the feeling return to her fingers in slow, uncomfortable pulses. She had perhaps 10 minutes, maybe fewer. She needed to decide what she was going to say. The honest version was also the catastrophic one. "I am not the woman named in your contract. I am the second daughter, the one no one prepared, sent here because the first one ran, and my father needed someone to stand in her place before the penalties destroyed him. I did not agree to this. I was told, not asked. And I have no idea what you were promised or what you actually want from this arrangement, but I can tell you with certainty that I am not it." She pressed her palms closer to the warmth of the fire. The practical version was more dangerous in a different way. Say nothing, answer to Celeste's name, and hope the discrepancy went unnoticed long enough for what, exactly? For her father to fix this somehow? Her father had never fixed anything in his life that had not first benefited him directly. There was a third option, one that had come to her somewhere in the final hour of the carriage ride, small and cold and surprisingly steady. Tell the truth, but tell it on her own terms, and before anyone else could frame it against her. Walk into this meeting as Ivy Ashford, not as her sister's shadow. Make it clear what had been done, to the contract, and to her. The risk was that the Alpha King would consider the substitution a deliberate insult from House Ashford. Which it was, functionally, even if her father would never describe it that way. The greater risk was that she said nothing. The truth emerged later anyway, and she was found to have known and concealed it from the moment she arrived. She was still standing at the hearth, turning this over, when the door opened. She had expected to hear it. She had not expected the shift in the air, that immediate physical change in the weight of the room, as though something had entered that displaced not just space, but atmosphere. She turned slowly, because moving quickly felt wrong in a way she couldn't entirely explain. He was larger than any man she had seen. not in the exaggerated, unwieldy way of men who had grown wide without care, but in the way of someone built with intention, every part of him proportionate and controlled. Dark hair braided back from his face, the rest of it falling long over a fur-lined pauldron fixed to black leather armor that he wore the way other men wore wool, as though it were simply part of him, unremarkable. His eyes were a pale, unsettling blue, the kind of color that existed at the very edge of a winter sky just before full dark. A faint scar ran below his left cheekbone, old and thin, barely visible. He stopped just inside the door. His gaze moved to her. Not slowly, the way men sometimes looked at women they intended to assess, but with a sudden, absolute stillness that was somehow more unnerving, as though he had seen her, and his body had made a decision his face had not yet agreed to report. Then his expression settled back into something careful and unreadable. "You are not Celeste Ashford," he said. His voice was low and even, with no particular inflection of anger or surprise. It was simply a statement of fact, delivered with the flat precision of a man who had spent years saying true things in rooms where people preferred not to hear them. Ivy's heart struck hard against her ribs. She kept her hands still at her sides. "No," she said. "I am not." A silence. "Then who are you?" "Ivy Ashford." She held his gaze. "The second daughter. Celeste left 3 nights ago. My father." She paused, and something in her chest pulled tight, and she let it, because she was not going to soften this into something easier to hear. "My father sent me in her place because the contract penalty would have ended our house. He did not tell the king because he hoped the difference would go unnoticed. I'm telling you now because I would rather you be angry with the truth than deceived by something more comfortable." The silence that followed was different from the first one. Heavier. Cassian Drave looked at her for a long moment. She watched something move across his face, not anger, or not only anger, and then resolve into that same unreadable stillness. "You could have said nothing," he said. "Yes. Most people in your position would have." "I know." He moved then, not toward her, but to the window, where he stood with his back partially to her, looking out at the snow falling on the inner courtyard. His hands were clasped behind him. She could see the tension in his jaw, the slow, deliberate way he was breathing. When he spoke again, his voice had not risen. "Your sister." She ran to someone. It was not a question. "I believe so," Ivy said carefully. "I don't know who. I was not told." "No," he said quietly. "You were not told very much at all, it seems." Something in that observation hit her in a way she hadn't prepared for. Not cruelly, not with pity, but with a precision that was almost worse than either. Because it was simply accurate. She had not been told. She had not been consulted, included, considered, or warned. She had been placed in a carriage and dispatched because she was the remaining piece that fit the necessary space. She did not answer. There was nothing to say that would improve on the silence. Cassian turned from the window. He studied her again, and this time she had the distinct, uncomfortable sensation that he was not cataloging her features or her clothing. He was reading something else. Something she couldn't name and couldn't quite conceal, because she didn't know precisely what it was he was seeing. "You'll stay," he said at last. She blinked. "I'm sorry. You'll remain at the keep." His voice was measured, carrying the particular weight of someone accustomed to saying things once. "The contract was with House Ashford. You are of House Ashford. The terms have not changed on my end. Whether your father intended this substitution as an insult or a convenience is a matter I will address separately and directly with him." "You're not—" She stopped, started again. "You're not sending me back. No. Why?" He looked at her steadily. "Because you walked into this room and told me the truth when no one was forcing you to. That is not a quality I discard." She stared at him. The fire crackled behind her. Snow tapped against the window glass in small, insistent rhythms. She had come here expecting to be managed, dismissed, or punished for something that had been done to her, rather than by her. She had prepared herself for contempt. She had not prepared herself for this, for being seen clearly and still found worth keeping, even by a man she had every reason to fear. She did not trust it, but she filed it carefully away, like a detail in a text she wasn't finished reading yet. "Very well," she said quietly. And that was how Ivy Ashford, the wrong daughter, the forgotten one, the girl who had been packed like luggage and shipped north as a replacement, stayed. Not because she had no choice, but because for the first time in her memory, someone had given her one. The room they gave her was not small. That was the first thing Ivy noticed. Not its warmth, not the canopied bed with its heavy linen curtains, not the writing desk positioned near the window where the morning light would fall cleanly across the surface. She noticed the size of it, because she had spent 23 years in a room at Ashford Manor that had functioned, in every practical sense, as a place to keep her out of the way. This room was different. It had been prepared for someone expected to matter. Whether that someone had been Celeste, or simply the concept of a bride, she couldn't say. But the hearth had been laid and lit. The water in the basin was warm. A tray had been brought with bread, hard cheese, and a small pot of something herbed and dark that smelled of pine and black pepper, and turned out to be a broth she drank in its entirety before she had fully decided to. She sat at the writing desk for a long time after, doing nothing. Her mind kept returning to the receiving room, to the way Cassian Drave had looked at her, that unnerving stillness, that quality of complete attention. Most men of power she had observed in her father's house had a way of looking at women that was fundamentally incurious. They took in what was relevant to them and dismissed the rest. Cassian had not done that. He had looked at her the way she looked at difficult texts in the library, as though she contained information he had not yet located but intended to find. It unsettled her in ways she didn't fully want to examine. She understood almost nothing about him. What she knew came from overheard council conversations and the dry accounts she had read in the historical records her father kept locked in his study. Records she had, over the years, quietly borrowed and returned. Cassian Drave had become Alpha King at 19, following the death of his father, under circumstances that the records described in the careful, passive language used when no one wanted to commit to a direct accusation. He had consolidated the northern pacts within 3 years. He had ended 2 border wars and begun none. His council feared him with the particular precision of men who feared being wrong in his presence rather than being hurt by his hand. He had never taken a mate. That detail had appeared in the records without comment, but she had noticed it. In shifter society, an unmated alpha of his age and status was either extraordinarily selective or carrying something unresolved. She had filed it away without drawing conclusions. Now it sat differently in her mind. She pressed her fingers against the wood grain of the desk and made herself think about something more immediately useful. Her father's plan, if it could be dignified with that word, had always been fragile. Cassian had seen through it in the space of a single breath. He had not exploded, had not sent her back in disgrace, had not immediately dispatched a war party to Ashford Manor. He had said, "You'll stay with the flat certainty of a man making a calculation, rather than a concession." What was the calculation? She didn't know yet, but she was aware, with the quiet clarity that had always been her most reliable instinct, that she was inside something with more dimensions than she could currently see. Her father's debts and the contract penalty were the surface of it. Underneath, there would be something else. There always was, in arrangements between powerful houses. She needed to understand the shape of it before she could understand her own position within it. Sleep, when it finally came, was heavy and dreamless. She was given a full day before she saw Cassian again. In that time, She explored as much of the keep as she reasonably could without appearing to do so deliberately. She walked slowly, stopped often, let her eyes move. The keep was a working fortress, not a court in the ornamental sense, but a functioning seat of pack governance. The great hall was used for actual assembly, its long tables worn smooth with years of use. The corridor outside the council chamber smelled of candle smoke and old parchment. The guards changed shifts with the quiet efficiency of people who did it, because the work required it, not because anyone was watching. She noted the location of the library on the second morning, tucked behind a narrow door off the east corridor. Smaller than her father's, but denser, its shelves holding territorial records and pack law texts and maps that she recognized as the kind never made available to outsiders. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, reading the spines. "You're welcome to use it." She turned. Cassian stood in the corridor behind her, in a plain dark tunic rather than armor, his braids partially loose from whatever they'd been tied into the night before. He looked, in this context, slightly less like a sovereign and slightly more like a man who had been awake since before dawn for reasons he had not shared with anyone. "Thank you," she said carefully. He nodded toward the shelves. "Is there something specific you're looking for?" "Not yet. I was orienting myself." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, but an adjustment, as though her answer had landed somewhere he hadn't expected. "Most people orient themselves by talking to other people," he said. "I find texts more reliable." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I have a council meeting in an hour. After it, I'd like to speak with you. There are things you should know about the contract, the original terms, and what I intend to do about your father's handling of it." Her pulse moved. "Of course. The meeting may run long. Aldrich will find you when I'm ready." He turned to go. She watched him take 2 steps down the corridor, and then, without fully intending to, spoke. "Lord King." He stopped, turned his head slightly. Why are the Northern Pack records from 30 years ago missing from those shelves? She had noticed 3 gaps in the chronological sequence on her first scan of the spines. The territorial logs run continuously until that decade, and then there are 3 years absent, a pause that lasted precisely long enough to confirm it was not an innocent one. "Because those years were not peaceful ones," he said, "and some records, when they exist in only one copy, are kept elsewhere for protection." She nodded slowly, as though this were a satisfying answer. It wasn't, but she catalogued it. The council meeting ran 2 hours. Aldrich came for her in the early afternoon. Cassian received her in the library, which she hadn't expected, and which she found, despite herself, a more comfortable choice than the formal receiving room would have been. He stood near the window with a sheaf of parchment in one hand, and he did not put it down immediately when she entered. He finished reading whatever he'd been reading, set it on the table, and then looked at her with that same quality of full attention. "Sit," he said, not unkindly. She sat. He remained standing, which she noted but did not comment on. "The contract your father signed was not a simple marriage arrangement. It was a territorial alliance. House Ashford holds land adjacent to the eastern border of the northern reaches, land that has been disputed for 60 years. The marriage was intended to consolidate that border legally and permanently, eliminating a vulnerability that both sides have been managing at cost for decades." Ivy absorbed this. "My father told me none of this." "No," Cassian said. "He would not have. Because if you had understood the full scope of what you were being sent into, you might have asked questions he didn't want to answer." "What questions?" He set one hand on the table, not leaning, simply resting. "The Ashford Eastern lands are the only viable corridor for a pack called the Voreth to move south without crossing my territory directly. For 60 years, House Ashford has been collecting border tolls from the Voreth in exchange for that passage. Your father has been taking Vorith silver for decades while presenting himself to the Northern Crown as a loyal vassal. The room was very quiet. He made an agreement with them, Ivy said slowly, and then agreed to a marriage alliance with you that would have closed that corridor permanently. Which means, Cassian said, watching her, that the marriage alliance was never something he intended to honor. It was a negotiating piece. Something to hold over the Vorith to extract better terms from them. He had no intention of delivering a bride who would actually bind House Ashford to the Northern Crown. And Celeste, Ivy said, and something in her voice came out very flat, knew this, and ran. Because if the marriage happened, the Vorith would have considered it a betrayal of their arrangement, and Celeste would have been living in the keep as a target, not a bride. Cassian said nothing. He did not need to. Ivy sat with her hands folded in her lap and felt the full, cold weight of it settle over her. Her father had not just used her as a replacement. He had sent her into a kill position. Whether he had calculated the Vorith threat fully or simply not cared to calculate it, the result was the same. She had been placed at the center of a political trap, handed to a king who had every reason to mistrust House Ashford, in a role that carried a target on its back. She had not been expendable to him. She had been useful, which was, she understood now, considerably worse. "How long have you known?" she asked. "About the Vorith arrangement?" "For some time." He looked at her directly. "What I did not know was which daughter your father would send, or whether she would arrive knowing any of this." "He didn't tell me." "I know," Cassian said quietly. "That was also apparent from the moment you walked in." She looked up at him. "You came in frightened and honest," he said. "Those two things together tell me everything about what kind of house you came from, and what was done to you in it." She did not respond immediately. The fire shifted in the hearth. Outside, the snow had stopped, and the courtyard below the window was white and silent. "What happens now?" she asked. Cassian straightened. "Now," he said, "we deal with your father, and with the Vorith. And I will need you to understand both situations clearly, because you are part of how this resolves. Not as a piece on a board, but as someone who has standing in this, and who I will not make decisions around without your knowledge." She studied him. "You're telling me this," she said slowly, "because you want my cooperation, or my trust. I'm telling you this," he said with a patience that did not feel performed, "because you deserve to know what you walked into. What you do with that information is yours to decide." Ivy looked at him for a long moment. The library smelled of old parchment and pine resin, and the faint char of the candle burning on the table between them. She did not trust him. Not yet. Trust was something she had learned to extend in very small amounts, after very long observation, to very few people. But she believed, in this moment, that he was telling her the truth. It was not the same thing, but it was a beginning. The letter arrived from Ashford Manor 4 days later. Ivy knew it had come before Aldrich told her. She had been in the library when she heard the rider in the courtyard below, the particular urgency of hooves on frozen stone at an hour too early for routine correspondence. She had kept her eyes on the page in front of her and waited, and when the knock came at the library door 20 minutes later, she was already composed. The letter was addressed to the Alpha King. Aldrich brought her a copy. At Cassian's instruction, he said, and left her alone to read it. Her father's handwriting was precise and slightly ornate, the hand of a man who had been educated to project authority through penmanship. She had seen it on hundreds of documents over her lifetime. She had never seen it used to describe her as the lesser daughter, dispatched in a moment of administrative confusion, whose presence at the Northern Keep represents a regrettable clerical error rather than any intentional misrepresentation. Administrative confusion. She read the phrase twice. Then she set the letter face down on the table and looked at the window for a moment, at the pale winter light coming through the leaded glass in long, cold rectangles. Administrative confusion. 23 years. That was how long she had been a daughter of House Ashford. She had eaten at her father's table, slept under his roof, worn clothes purchased with his coin, and been educated by tutors he had employed. Tutors assigned to Celeste first, who Ivy had simply been permitted to share because sending her away separately would have cost more. She had been present at every family occasion, every formal dinner, every seasonal gathering. She had been there, and when it became necessary to describe her to the most powerful alpha on the continent, her father had chosen the phrase, administrative confusion. She breathed in. She breathed out. Something that had been soft in her. Some last, stubborn tenderness toward the idea of her father's house. The loyalty that persists in people who have never truly been seen by the ones they were loyal to, completed its long, quiet process of dying. She turned the letter back over and finished reading. The substance of it was a request for her return and an offer to renegotiate the alliance terms with Celeste, who had apparently, her father wrote this with remarkable composure, resolved her personal reservations about the arrangement and was now prepared to fulfill her original obligations. No explanation for where Celeste had been. No acknowledgement of the Vorith. No mention of the border tolls, or the 60 years of collected silver, or the target her father had placed on the back of whoever sat in this position. Just a request, phrased as a courtesy, with the particular confidence of a man who had not yet understood that the ground had shifted under him. She folded the letter carefully and brought it to Cassian's study. He was at his desk when she entered. Maps spread across the surface, weighted at the corners with iron pieces, the kind of detailed territorial rendering she had only ever seen in her father's locked records. He looked up when she came in and took in her expression before she said a word. She placed the letter on the desk beside the maps and sat in the chair across from him without being invited to, which was not something she would have done 4 days ago. He read it. She watched his face and saw very little, because he was very good at controlling what his face reported. When he finished, he set it down. Administrative confusion, she said. Yes, a pause. I read it the same way you did. He wants me back so he can send Celeste. He thinks you'll accept the exchange. He thinks, Cassian said carefully, that I have no particular investment in which Ashford daughter is here, as long as the alliance proceeds. He is operating on the assumption that you are interchangeable. Are we? He looked at her directly. No. The word came out without hesitation, and it landed with a weight she hadn't prepared for. She kept her expression even. Then what do you intend to tell him? Cassian leaned back slightly, not looking away from her. I intend to tell him that the substitution, however it was framed, resulted in the arrival of an Ashford daughter at the Northern Keep, and that the terms of the alliance will now be renegotiated. Not with him, but through proper Pack Council process, with a territorial audit of the eastern border included, and that any arrangement he has maintained with the Vorith will be disclosed in full before those negotiations conclude. He'll refuse, Ivy said. He'll claim the audit exceeds your jurisdiction. He'll send Celeste here with a formal apology and try to reset the entire situation as though none of this happened. He can try. Something in Cassian's voice settled into a register she had not heard from him before. Not louder, not harder, but more final, the way a door sounds when it is bolted rather than simply closed. But the audit has already begun. My border commanders have been in the eastern corridor for 2 days. Whatever your father has been moving across that land in exchange for Vorith silver, we will find the record of it. Ivy was quiet for a moment. If you've already started, why tell me any of this? Because the audit will reach your father's house within the fortnight. When it does, his response may include attempts to use you, your position here, your name, your cooperation, as a negotiating piece. I want you to understand the situation completely so that when those attempts come, you can recognize them. She held his gaze. You're protecting me from being used as a tool. I'm ensuring, he said, "that you have enough information to protect yourself. That is not the same thing." She considered that. The distinction mattered to her more than she could easily explain. The difference between being shielded and being equipped. She had spent her entire life being managed by people who made decisions around her, rather than with her. What Cassian was doing felt different in a way she was still learning to name. "There's something else," she said. "In the Eastern records, the 3 missing years." A stillness came over him that confirmed she had been right to notice. "Those years," she continued carefully, "correspond to a period I found referenced in 2 separate Pack law texts, both of which described a territorial reclassification in the Eastern Corridor. The language was vague, the kind of vague that is deliberate." She paused. Was the Vorith Corridor classified as neutral ground during that period? And if so, who authorized it? Cassian looked at her for a long moment. The study was quiet around them, the fire low, the maps between them holding their silent geography. "My father," he said at last. "The authorization was my father's. 3 years before his death, he entered into a private arrangement with the Vorith leadership that reclassified a portion of the eastern border without council knowledge. Your father's house was the intermediary. The border tolls began then. And when your father died..." "The arrangement continued," Cassian said, and something in his voice was very controlled. "Because the parties involved had no incentive to surface it. The Vorith kept their corridor. Your father kept his silver, and the Northern Crown was left holding a border vulnerability that no one would formally acknowledge." She absorbed this slowly. "You've known about your father's involvement for how long?" "Long enough." "And the missing records?" "Were removed by someone who understood what they contained and wanted them inaccessible to anyone who came looking." His jaw tightened slightly. "I have reason to believe that person was a member of my own council at the time. Someone who is no longer in that position, but whose work in dismantling what my father arranged has been incomplete." The fire shifted. A log settled with a soft collapse of ember. Ivy sat with all of it, turning it over, feeling the shape of the thing. It was larger than she had understood. Larger than a marriage contract. Larger than her father's debts. Larger than the Vorith's border access. It reached back 30 years, through 2 houses and 2 kings, through deliberate silence and removed records and silver-changing hands in corridors that no one had been meant to examine too closely. And she had been dropped into the center of it by accident. Or perhaps, she thought slowly, not entirely by accident. Her father was not a clever man in the way that counted, but he was a careful one. He had known Cassian would discover the substitution. He had sent her anyway. Had he calculated that a daughter who knew nothing, who had no political training, who arrived honest and bewildered, would be less threatening to investigate than Celeste, who might have known enough to be dangerous? Had he sent her precisely because she was safe to discard? "Lord King," she said. "Cassian," he said, without particular emphasis, as though he had been waiting a while to say it. She paused. Cassian. The name sat differently in her mouth than she'd expected. "My father's eastern lands. If the audit finds what you believe it will find, what happens to those lands?" "They revert to the Crown's administration until the dispute is formally resolved through council." "And the house? The title?" He looked at her steadily. "That depends on the scope of the violations and whether the lord of that house is willing to cooperate with the process or resist it." "He will resist it," she said. There was no bitterness in her voice, just accuracy. "He has never done anything that cost him something without being made to." "I know. I want to be part of the process," she said, not as an Ashford who is managed and informed after the fact, as someone with standing who participates in what happens to that house and those lands. "You said I had standing here. I want to use it." Something shifted in Cassian's expression. Not surprise, but a settling, as though something he had been watching for had arrived. "Then you will," he said. She nodded once. Her hands were steady in her lap. Her voice had been steady the entire conversation. She was faintly aware that something had moved in her. Past the hollow numbness of the carriage ride, past the careful composure of the first days, into something harder and cleaner and considerably more dangerous. It was not yet what she would have called rage, but it was what came just before it, and it felt, for the first time in a very long time, entirely like her own. Outside the study window, the sky had cleared to a deep, cold blue. The snow on the courtyard below caught the afternoon light and held it, bright and sharp and unforgiving. Somewhere to the south, her father was composing a second letter, calculating his next position, moving his remaining pieces across the board with the serene confidence of a man who had always been able to afford the cost of other people. He did not know yet that one of those pieces had stopped being his. The audit party returned from the eastern corridor on a Thursday, when the sky was the color of iron and the wind came down from the mountains, carrying the smell of coming snow and something colder underneath it. Ivy was in the library when she heard the horses. She did not go to the window immediately. She finished the sentence she was reading, a passage in a pack law text about the legal weight of territorial testimony given by a non-shifter witness. And then she set the book down, straightened her cloak, and went to find Cassian. She did not need to find him. He was already in the corridor outside the library, moving toward the great hall with two of his commanders beside him, and he slowed when he saw her without being asked to. "Come," he said simply. She fell into step beside him. The audit commanders spread their findings across the council table in the great hall. Parchment after parchment of territorial records, border crossing logs, and ledger copies that had been made from documents found at 3 separate locations along the eastern corridor, including one hidden beneath the floor of an unmaintained way station that had not appeared on any official map of the region. The smell of old paper and damp earth filled the room. Ivy stood at the edge of the table and read everything she was handed without comment, her face composed, her mind moving fast and very cold. The record was complete. 60 years of Vorith silver flowing into Ashford accounts through a network of intermediaries so carefully constructed that, viewed in isolation, no single transaction would have condemned anyone. But viewed together, laid out across the council table in chronological order, cross-referenced against the missing years and the reclassification documents that Cassian's people had located in a separate archive in the Northern Territories, the picture was absolute. Her father had not merely accepted Vorith silver. He had actively maintained the arrangement through 2 generations, renegotiated its terms twice, and, most significantly, had used his position as the Northern Crown's nominal Eastern vassal to suppress at least 2 independent investigations into border irregularities, both of which had been quietly buried before they reached Cassian's council. He had done all of this while presenting himself as a loyal ally of the Northern Crown, while signing a marriage contract with that same crown as a performance of good faith he had never intended to honor, while sending his younger daughter north as a placeholder, expendable and uninformed, into a situation he understood would eventually become dangerous. Ivy set down the last ledger page. Her hands were perfectly steady. One of the commanders, a gray-haired woman named Soren, who had the compact, deliberate physicality of someone who had spent decades in fieldwork rather than ceremony, looked at her across the table. "You knew none of this," she said. It was not quite a question. "No," Ivy said. "I knew my father was not an honest man. I did not know the full dimensions of it." Soren held her gaze for a moment, then nodded once, with the particular respect of someone who does not distribute it carelessly. Cassian, standing at the head of the table, looked at Ivy. "The council will convene formally tomorrow. Your father will be summoned to answer the audit findings under pack law jurisdiction. The eastern corridor falls within Crown territory under the reclassification reversal, which means Ashford's arrangement with the Vorith constitutes a violation of territorial sovereignty, not merely a civil matter." He paused. "You have standing as an Ashford heir. You can give testimony. You don't have to." "I will," Ivy said. No hesitation, no performance of reluctance. Just the clean, flat certainty of someone who had decided something days ago and was only now being given the opportunity to act on it. Lord Edmund Ashford arrived at the Northern Keep 6 days later, summoned by a formal Crown writ that he could not refuse without constituting open defiance. He came with a small retinue, 4 attendants, a legal advisor, and Celeste, whom he had apparently decided to bring as a visual argument for renegotiation. Ivy watched them arrive from the upper corridor window. Celeste looked exactly as she always had, composed, beautiful, wearing a traveling cloak of deep blue wool that had clearly been chosen with care. She moved through the courtyard below, with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to being observed. Ivy watched her, and felt something she had expected to feel, as grief or anger arrive instead, as a kind of clarity, clean and almost impersonal. Celeste had run. She had known the danger, had understood what their father intended, and had chosen herself without a word to the sister being sent in her place. Ivy did not hate her for it, but she was done making room for her. Their father looked older than she remembered, though it had only been weeks. He moved with the careful dignity of a man who had decided that confidence was the correct performance for this occasion, and the cracks in that performance were visible only if you knew where to look. She had always known where to look with him. She turned from the window and went to prepare for the council session. The formal hearing took place in the great hall, the council seated at the long table, Cassian at its head. Lord Ashford sat across from the assembled pack council, with his legal advisor beside him, and Celeste positioned slightly behind, a visual suggestion of family unity that fooled no one in the room. Ivy sat at the council table, not behind it, not to the side. At it, in the chair Cassian had indicated when she entered, between Commander Soren and the council's territorial law interpreter. Her father's eyes moved to her when she sat down, and something passed across his face. Surprise, recalculation, and then a careful neutrality that she recognized as the expression he used when he was rearranging his approach in real time. She looked back at him without expression. The hearing was methodical. The audit findings were presented in full. The legal interpreter walked through the territorial violations with the unhurried precision of someone who had done this many times and found no pleasure in it. Her father's legal advisor objected twice, both times on procedural grounds, both times overruled. Celeste sat very still and said nothing. When the time came for testimony, Ivy spoke clearly and without elaboration. She described what she had been told, what she had not been told, and what she had understood in the carriage on the way north. The shape of the arrangement becoming visible to her, only after she had already been placed inside it. She did not perform distress. She did not editorialize. She gave the council what she had, accurately and in sequence. And when she finished, she set her hands flat on the table and waited. Her father looked at her for a long moment from across the table. "Ivy," he said, and his voice carried the particular tone he had always used when he wanted her to understand that she was making a mistake. "You are speaking against your own house. I am speaking the truth about my own house," she said. "Those are not the same thing." He had no answer for that. She watched him understand that he did not, and watched him look away. The council's ruling came the following morning. The Eastern Ashford lands were placed under Crown administration, pending a full resolution of the territorial violations, a process that would take no less than 2 years and would require Lord Ashford's active cooperation with every stage of the audit process. The Vorith leadership was separately summoned to answer for their role in the arrangement, and the corridor they had used for 60 years was formally closed pending renegotiation under Crown terms. Lord Ashford's title was not stripped. Cassian had made this decision deliberately, and he explained it to Ivy the evening before the ruling was announced. Stripping the title creates a power vacuum in the Eastern Territories that the Vorith would move to fill within a season, he said. Leaving him with the title but removing the land and the revenue removes his leverage without destabilizing the border further. He becomes a lord of a house with a name and no resources. That is a more complete consequence than removing the name alone. Ivy had thought about this. He will spend the rest of his life trying to recover the position. Yes, Cassian said, and he will not succeed. The audit record is permanent. No ally in the Northern Territories will extend credit or political support to a house under Crown administration for violations of this scope. He will manage, but he will never again be a threat. She was quiet for a moment. The fire in the library hearth had burned low, and neither of them had moved to add wood. Celeste, she said, is free to go where she chooses. She committed no violation under pack law. Cassian looked at her. She is not your responsibility. I know. Ivy looked at the low fire. I just wanted to say her name in this conversation, to include her in the accounting, even if the accounting doesn't punish her. She paused. She knew what she was running from. She didn't warn me. I needed to say that out loud, I think, and then put it down. Cassian said nothing. He simply waited, with the quality of stillness she had come to understand was not absence, but presence. The particular attention of someone who understood that some things needed to be said into silence rather than answered. After a moment, she exhaled slowly. It's done, she said. Not to him exactly. To herself, to the room. To the girl who had been packed into a carriage in the dark and told she was a replacement for something she had never been offered in the first place. It's done, she said again, and this time it felt true. She stayed at the Northern Keep, not because the contract required it. Cassian had made clear, in the days after the hearing, that the original terms of the alliance were being renegotiated from the ground up, and that her presence was not contingent on any arrangement her father had made. She was free to leave. He had said so directly, without using it as leverage, which she had noticed. She stayed because she had looked at the alternative, returned to a manor under Crown administration, in a house stripped of influence, with a father who had described her in writing as an administrative confusion, and found that it held nothing she wanted to go back to. She stayed because the library here was better, because Commander Soren had begun including her in the border review meetings without being asked to, because the keep smelled of pine resin and old stone and wood smoke, and she had, without entirely noticing, started to find that smell like coming home. She stayed because of Cassian. That part had arrived slowly, the way warmth does in a very cold room. Not in a single moment, but in accumulation. In the evenings in the library when they read in companionable silence on opposite sides of the table. In the morning he had appeared quietly at the door of her room, when she had been ill for 2 days, with a winter cold she refused to admit was serious, and had left a tray with broth and willowbark tea without comment or expectation of gratitude. In the council meetings where he asked her opinion, and then listened to it. Actually listened, adjusted his thinking, sometimes changed his position because of what she said. In the night, 3 weeks after the hearing, when she had woken from a dream, she couldn't quite remember. But that had left her sitting upright in the dark, with her heart striking hard and her breath unsteady, and had found, when she finally moved to the window, that there was a large dark wolf sitting in the snow of the courtyard below, perfectly still, facing the keep, facing her window. She had looked down at him for a long time. He had not moved. She had not called out or gestured. She had simply stood at the window until her breathing settled, until the residue of whatever the dream had been dissolved in the cold night air, and then she had gone back to bed and slept without interruption until morning. She had not mentioned it. He had not mentioned it either. But something between them had shifted after that night, the way a door shifts on its hinges when the frame settles. Not broken, not forced, simply moved into better alignment. She told him she loved him on a morning in early spring, when the snow had begun pulling back from the courtyard stones, and the light through the library window was different, softer, with a faint gold in it that had been absent all winter. She told him without preamble, without building toward it, because she had learned that the most important thing she said came out most clearly when she stopped preparing them. "I love you," she said, looking up from the text she had been reading. I wanted to say it plainly, without it being attached to a particular moment or a crisis, just plainly, while nothing is happening. Cassian looked at her from across the table. The pale blue of his eyes in the morning light was very clear. "I know," he said, and then, quietly, "I love you. I have been waiting for a moment that felt safe enough for you to say it first." She held his gaze. "You could have said it first." "I could have," he agreed, "but it mattered more that you arrived at it yourself." She thought about that. About a man powerful enough to command 300,000 acres of territory and the loyalty of every pack within it, who had chosen to wait, not out of pride or strategy, but out of the understanding that what she needed most was to come to something on her own terms, in her own time, without the weight of his wanting pressing against her decision. She thought she had never been loved more carefully in her life. They were formally bonded in midsummer, in a ceremony witnessed by the full pack council, and conducted at dawn, in the old way, in the courtyard where snow had once covered the stones, and a dark wolf had kept watch through the night. Ivy wore no borrowed finery. She wore a dress of deep gray wool with silver thread at the cuffs, made by the keep seamstress to her own specification, and her hair braided properly this time. Carefully, by her own hands, the way she wanted it. Cassian stood across from her in the early morning light, with the particular expression she had come to know as the one he kept only for her. Not the sovereign's controlled composure, but something quieter and more unguarded, the face of a man who had stopped needing to protect himself from being seen. Commander Soren stood at the edge of the courtyard with her arms crossed, and what was unmistakably, if reluctantly, a look of satisfaction on her weathered face. Aldrich wept quietly into a handkerchief and pretended he was not. Lord Ashford was not present. He was managing, as Cassian had predicted, the diminished affairs of a house under Crown administration. He would continue managing them, quietly, without influence or leverage, for the rest of his life. He would not recover what he had lost. Not the lands, not the revenue, not the political standing he had spent decades constructing on a foundation of someone else's silence. Celeste was not present either. She had gone east, to a smaller territory, with the man she had chosen over a king's contract. Ivy did not know if she was happy. She had stopped needing to know. The officiant spoke the bonding words in the old language, and the morning light came over the top of the keep's eastern wall and fell across the courtyard in a long, clean sweep of gold. Ivy felt the bond settle into her, not as a thing imposed, but as a thing completed, as the last piece of something that had been finding its shape for months, finally, quietly, coming to rest. She looked at Cassian. He was already looking at her. "Still frightened?" he asked, low enough that only she could hear it. She considered the question with the same care she gave everything that deserved it. "No," she said, "not anymore." And she meant it in every possible way. Not just of him, not just of the bond, but of the future, of the keep that had become her home, of the woman she had become in the months since a carriage had carried her away from everything she had known and deposited her, alone and honest and entirely unprepared, at the gates of the only place that had ever asked her to be exactly herself. She had come here as the wrong bride. She had turned out to be exactly right. Not for the contract. Not for the alliance. Not for the political calculation that had set all of it in motion. For him. And for herself. That was enough. That was everything. The courtyard was quiet and golden and cold at the edges, the way spring mornings are before the world has fully committed to warmth. The pack gathered at the walls watched in silence. The bond held, and was real, and had been chosen by both of them with full knowledge of what the other cost and what the other offered. It did not need anything more than that. It was done. And it was good. And it was theirs.